Crossing Church. How are you today? You doing good? You look great. Beautiful day. I want to welcome all of our campuses that are joining us from Macomb, from Kirksville, from Hannibal, from Pittsfield, 929. I'm just so thankful that we have that opportunity just to reach out and use technology to reach out and to be connected through the Word of God. It's just awesome to be able to do that, and God's just doing so many awesome things, and we have the opportunity to share in that. It's great. It's just great. And you know, we've been in this series called Shocking Statements of Jesus. And I mean, we've gone through some crazy ones. We've gone through some really shocking ones, like if your hand causes you to stumble, do what? Yeah, cut it off and throw it away. He talks about your foot. He talks about your eye. And it's, you know, really, really incredible statement that Jesus is saying. He says, you know, if somebody asks you for something, just give it to them. And you know, we don't tend to do that. He doesn't say, beware of your enemies or hate your enemies. He says, love your enemies. That's really a shocking statement. He says, always forgive. How many times? All the time. Always forgive. What is Jesus doing when he's making these statements that we read in the Gospels in the midst of his teaching? What is he trying to accomplish? He's trying to reboot our faith. He's trying to give us a change in perspective. He's trying to move us in the direction of real transformation. And in John chapter 6, Jesus is preaching a sermon. It's called the Bread of Life sermon. And I think this one, of all of his shocking statements, has to be close to the top of the list. And if it doesn't make the top of the list as far as a shocking statement goes, it definitely is at the top of the list as far as the reaction goes. And you see, I don't think that Jesus was making these statements just to capture attention or just to get a reaction, just to watch how people dealt with it. I think there was real solid teaching in every one of these statements. And this time, when he said what he said in John 6, it had a huge, profound reaction. I want us to read what he said, the actual words he said, because if there were a shocking statement, this is it. Okay, so 54th and 55th verse of John 6. And this is something he actually says over and over in the sermon. So Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in yourselves. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up on the last day. Shocking? Crazy. It really goes past shocking. I mean, there are shocking statements that are like, wow. And then there are some that just go past that. Like, if there's a category on the other side of shocking, this is it. This is crazy. People are looking at him, and you can see that look on their face, and just kind of going, did I just hear you right? I'm sure I didn't. I'm sure that was wrong. Did that guy just say that he had to give us his flesh to eat and his blood to drink? That's crazy. I mean, I think about stories that are happening in the news today. I mean, some of you have heard of Rudy Eugene, right? The infamous naked man in Miami who ate the face off of a homeless man. I mean, it was just crazy, the story. I mean, we read that and was like, what are you doing? People are going, you know, zombie apocalypse. Somebody are, conjecturing that he was sniffing bath salts, a new kind of mega amphetamine. I mean, just horrible, crazy things. And of course, that fits into our culture right now. There's really a zombie culture. They actually have zombie parades and stuff in New York. It's crazy. Why are people doing this? Well, what's so cool about that? I mean, we have movie series now that are, I mean, just totally making like vampirism a really cool thing. Some of you guys girls are in love with Edward Cullen, aren't you? Oh yeah, his skin turns like diamonds and stuff. It's awesome. He doesn't ever have to eat any food. And why are we making that so romantic? This idea of vampirism, of so eating flesh and drinking. I mean, it's really gross. It's awful. It's beyond shocking. It's really crazy. Now, you and I know later on, this statement is going to make perfect sense, right? I mean, right now, if you're a Christian, you get this. You completely get it. You know exactly what Jesus is talking about. When he's talking about eating my flesh and drinking my blood, he's talking about how his body and his blood are going to be symbols of God's redemption. He is the Passover lamb, right? And when God sees the blood, he will pass over you. And when we take communion, we're remembering that reality, right? When we take the piece of bread and drink the juice, we're remembering that reality. And in a sense, in a spiritual sense, we are eating his flesh, we are drinking his blood. I know that it sounds a little creepy, but it helps to remind us of the terrible price that was paid so that we could have our salvation. We understand, but they didn't understand. And Jesus didn't stop to explain it. He didn't say, now this is what I mean when I talk about, when I'm saying eat my flesh or drink my blood, and then you'll have eternal life. He didn't explain it. He just said that. And people are going, what are you talking about? Beyond shocking, almost crazy. I want us to understand the context of this story. So what really drives it home. The context of the story is the feeding of the 5,000. Now, maybe know the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus wanted to get away with his disciples. They got in the boat. They went across the Sea of Galilee, and they wanted to kind of have some time to themselves. But the people, all this multitude that were waiting to hear more of Jesus' teaching, actually skirted around, walked around the Sea of Galilee, and when they got out of the boat on the other side, this whole crowd was waiting for them. And so Jesus continued to teach, and he taught them all day until it was getting toward evening. He looked at his disciples, and he says, you need to give them something to eat. Now, the Bible says 5,000 men. So that didn't include women, and that didn't include children. So people conjecture that the actual crowd was probably somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people, which is a huge, huge crowd. When you think about the city of Capernaum that Jesus came from, the whole population of that city was 1,500 at its highest. So 15 to 20,000 people are people from everywhere that have come to hear this man speak, to watch him do these incredible miracles of healing and so forth. And now, what are they doing? Now, they're hungry. They've heard his teaching. Jesus tells his disciples, you give them something to eat. Well, they look at Jesus and they go, how are we going to do that? I mean, all there is this one lunch of this little kid. That's it. 5 loaves and 2 small fish. And you know what Jesus does? He raises up those 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he blesses them, and he breaks them. He tears them apart, and he starts handing them out, and he gives it to his disciples, and it continues to multiply so that all the people are fed. They're all completely fed. They're fed until they're full. And then they take up 12 basketfuls of leftovers. That's how much it produced and reproduced. We need to understand that food in Bible times was a very big deal. And food today in most of the world is a very big deal. I know for us, it's just having the argument that we have in the car on which place we're going to go eat. But for them, it was all about life and survival. Remember, this is a place that didn't have refrigeration, didn't have freezers, didn't have things like that. And so they had to prepare fresh food all the time for people that would eat. Can you imagine having a crowd of 15 to 20,000 people? It would have been impossible to feed that many people by any conventional means. Would have been absolutely impossible. Just forget about it. And not only was it impossible just because of the state of technology at that time, people didn't eat much. They went without food. People were hungry a lot. In American culture, sometimes it's difficult to understand how people could be hungry. The rest of the world understands what it's like to be hungry. Jesus' culture understood what it was like to be hungry. You and I, we struggle understanding what it's like to be hungry. But these people were accustomed to that. So the idea of someone giving them free food, enough food that they would be full, and enough food that there would be food left over for a group that big would have been huge. It would have been absolutely amazing. It makes perfect sense then that they wanted to make Jesus king. I mean, who wouldn't want Jesus to be king? If Jesus is king, what happens? We get food. We make Jesus king, Jesus gives us food. I can see the campaign slogan, Jesus, feed us. Jesus is going to feed us. I can see the button. Vote for Jesus. He'll feed us. They were going to make him king. And then they go back to the other side of the lake. There's quite a story there about Jesus walking on water and the storm and everything. But they get on the other side, back to this little town of Capernaum, this town of 1,500. Jesus goes in the synagogue, and the people, once again, follow Jesus all the way around the lake for another meal. So they go to Jesus in the synagogue in Capernaum, and they go, okay, now what can you do to show us that you're this great leader? What can you do now? What kind of trick can you do now? How are you at making breakfast? And so Jesus begins to preach the sermon about him being the bread of life. You're all concerned about food. You need to have food that will last. You need to have food that will take you all the way to heaven. Very similar to what he said to the woman at the well. If I give you this water, you'll never be thirsty again. He's saying to this crowd that if you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you'll have all you need. You'll never be hungry or thirsty again. And this will take you all the way to eternity. Of course, they didn't get it. And he says what he said, what I read just a little bit ago, and this is how the crowd responds. And not just the crowd, but his own disciples. Not apostles, but disciples. Look at verse 60. It says, therefore, many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, this is a difficult statement. Who can listen to it? This is a difficult statement. Who can listen to it? In other words, we can't listen to your teaching. Who could? Because you're crazy, Jesus. You can do some amazing things, and we really think that's cool. But what you're talking about now is nuts, and we just need to get away. As a matter of fact, I don't see them responding to Jesus in an angry way, more in a disillusioned way. Like, what? It doesn't make any sense. And I can see him filing out of that synagogue. I've stood in that synagogue. I've stood where Jesus stood when he preached that message. And you can just imagine those people walking out. This huge crowd, could be as many as 20,000 walking away. They would have completely surrounded that synagogue. And when they heard that, they just said, no, that can't be right. And walked away. You know, Jesus was hated in most of Israel. He was hated in most of the synagogues. He was definitely hated in Jerusalem. But this was the exception to the rule. Capernaum was the exception to the rule. And there was a couple of reasons why people liked him in Capernaum. One, especially in that synagogue, one is the guy who paid for the synagogue was a centurion, and Jesus healed his servant. Remember that? And it was that centurion that paid for that synagogue. There was a synagogue ruler or synagogue leader there, and his name was Jairus. And his daughter died, and Jesus raised his daughter back to life. So this synagogue had a special place in its heart for Jesus. He had done some specific things there, and they wanted to believe him. They wanted to lean into him. But when he said this, they couldn't stay with him anymore. They couldn't handle that. I want you to see what happened to the 12, Jesus' apostles. What happened to the 12 in this moment? Up to this moment, these guys are rock stars. They're rock stars. I mean, you couldn't even get close to them. You just imagine Jesus and his 12 apostles walking or getting in a boat or doing anything, and 15 to 20,000 people are following him. Just imagine, how close do you think you could get to Jesus? What kind of a view could you get of him? You couldn't even get close. Now, these 12 that were with him, they were always right around Jesus. They were his posse. They were his entourage, you know, and so everybody knew that those were the 12 that were always around Jesus. So just being around Jesus made them rock stars. I mean, made them very, very famous, important people. As a matter of fact, Jesus had given them power so that they could accomplish miraculous things themselves. So some of these people may have been following, not so much because of Jesus, but because Simon Peter had done something, or John had done something, or Thomas had done something, and they were following for that. So these guys were like rock stars because they've been around Jesus, and now how were they viewed? Because of what Jesus has just said, now they look crazy. Now that's pretty important to understand, because this big crowd that's around Jesus, to those 12 apostles, that crowd is really valuable. Really valuable. Remember, I told you that Jesus is hated in most of Israel. They don't like him because he's this rebel, this guy who's preaching this crazy message and making all of the Jewish religious leaders look bad all the time. So they don't like him. But Jesus has got this huge crowd around him all the time, which means they can't get to him. They can't get to him without inciting a riot, because that crowd is like a buffer. That crowd is like a safety. And so those 12 apostles have got to feel pretty good to know that there's 15 or 20,000 people that are always around them that protect them from whatever these Jewish religious leaders might want to do. That crowd was valuable. Can't you see Simon Peter? When Jesus is saying, you need to eat my flesh and you need to drink my blood, because if you don't do that, you don't have any life in you. But if you eat my flesh and you drink my blood, then I'll raise you up on the last day. And can't you just see Simon Peter like walking up there like real carefully and putting his hand over the microphone and going, we need to talk. Because like what you're saying, man, I don't understand it. It's not coming across right. People aren't getting it. And all kinds of weird stuff's happening out in that crowd right now. People are talking about leaving. You know, I can just see Simon Peter just kind of getting in front of Jesus and going, why don't you just, we'll be right back. And having a little talk with him. Yeah, I don't know if you ate a bad fish or what, Jesus, but this is not making sense. That isn't what happened. Peter didn't do that, but Peter and the rest of the apostles were definitely upset about what Jesus was saying. Look at verse 61. It says, but Jesus, conscious that his disciples grumbled at this, said to them, does this cause you to stumble? So it's definitely bothering all of them, including the 12. The 12 don't understand what Jesus is saying, and Jesus usually at least takes them aside and explains what he's trying to say, but this time he doesn't do that. So what is going on? Now, what ends up happening is this entire crowd that's following Jesus for the next meal or for the next miracle or whatever, they all leave. All of them. So if there were 20,000 people, 19,988 left. And all that's left are 12 former rock stars who all look as crazy as Jesus does because they're staying in the synagogue with him when everybody else walks away. Why would Jesus do this? Why would he say what he's saying? What is in this shocking statement that we need to learn and bring into our own hearts and let it change us. Why would he do it? This was probably the most defining moment in the lives of these 12. Jesus was doing this intentionally. He was doing this on purpose. And it was the critical mass for these 12. Look at John chapter 6, verse 66. It says, as a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. Look at verse 67. So Jesus said to the 12, you do not want to go away also, do you? What was happening? Why would Jesus do this? What was his intentionality? They were entering into a new stage of discipleship. Up to this point, what's the downside? Up to this point, what had happened in their lives? Yeah, I know that they left their fishing business and they followed Jesus, sure. But everywhere they went, people were welcoming them into their homes. They were like super famous, right? Everybody was giving them whatever they needed to survive and more than that. Where's the downside of the decision that they made? This is the point where they were forced to realize that this decision that I've made to follow Jesus, it's going to cost me. Up until this, it was really just giving them things. But now it's going to cost them. It's going to cost them a lot. And guess what? There's going to come a time, if you're not there or haven't been there already, when you make the decision to become a fully devoted follower of Jesus Christ, to say, I want to be his disciple, I don't want to be a fan, I want to be a follower, it's going to cost you something. It may cost you a lot. It may cost you everything. That was weird. You know what happens here? This is when idealism catches up with you. You know, we all tend to start out life pretty idealistically, don't we? We start out life always thinking about the way things ought to be. They really ought to be like this, and they ought to be like that, and we get frustrated, don't we? If things don't look exactly the way we think that they ought to look like. But then as we go through life, we start realizing what happens when we start living idealistically and how much it actually is going to cost us. And this is where that catches up with them, and this is where it catches up. I remember this happening to me. I remember God calling me into the ministry. I was 20 years old, and I had 2.5 years at Indiana University as a business major, and God called me into the ministry, and I got in my car, and I went to a place I'd never been to before, Joplin, Missouri. And I did it on faith, and I was just running on faith, and I was excited about it through faith, and I was full of that idealism because I felt the passion of Christ inside of me, and I got in that dorm room, and I started doing my classes, and I started to go through my school year, and I remember, telling my parents, God's going to take care of it. God's going to take care of my needs. My parents said, listen, we can't give you any money. If you're going to do this, you got to do it on your own. We can't help you. And I go, it's not going to be a problem. God's going to take care of me. And I remember being 20 years old, sitting on my bolster bed in my dorm room, and it was going to be 3 days because they didn't have school on Monday. It was Friday afternoon. I was going to have Saturday and Sunday and Monday. And the cafeteria was closed those days because school was out Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. And I didn't have any money. So I wasn't going to eat for 3 days. And this was before bank cards and cell phones and stuff like that. And everybody was going home for the weekend. I didn't even have any money to put gas in my car. I had nothing. And I remember when that reality hit me, when I got past idealism, and I'm sitting there on my bed, and I have my head in my hands, and I'm going, what am I going to do? How am I going to get through? How am I going to survive this? I just can't. I mean, really? I had never even had to think about going without food before, and all of a sudden, my idealistic decision to become a minister of the gospel had taken me to this point. And I started to pray. God, I don't know what I'm going to do. God, would you help me? This is the absolute truth. I am not stretching the truth one bit. While I was praying that prayer, the person who delivers the mail went down my hallway, and I saw an envelope went underneath my door. That's the way they delivered mail, my dorm. And I stopped in the middle of my prayer, and tears rolling down my face, and I picked up the envelope, and it was from my youth sponsors at my home church who had never contacted me up to that point. And I opened up that envelope, and inside the envelope was a card saying, you know what, God just laid you on our hearts, and a $50 bill. And I'll never forget that moment. $50 is not very much money to me anymore. But at that time, it was beyond incredible. When I'd learned to live on macaroni and cheese and, popcorn, it was pretty amazing to have that money. And you know what was even more amazing is when I went back to pray, I realized that God had answered my prayer 3 days before I asked it. But I realized if I'm going to be a Christ follower, it's going to cost me. And we're going to come to that place in our lives where we say, hey, this isn't what I signed up for. This is not what I expected. I had this idea, I had this plan, I had this future. At least that's the way I perceived it, and now it's not happening that way, and I don't know if I'm in for that. We could be saying that in our marriage. Well, this is what I thought it should look like. This is what I thought it should be like. Now it isn't, or this commitment I made, or this job I wanted so bad. Regardless, I think sometimes we get to that point. And that's where those guys got. That's where those 12 that were following Jesus, out of this shocking statement, all of a sudden they were alone. They didn't have that buffer around them. They weren't rock stars anymore. Now if we follow Jesus, it may cost us our lives. And it actually ended up doing that very thing. In verse 68, when Jesus asked them, are you going to go away as well? It says, Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. That is an incredibly insightful statement. Simon Peter makes some real dumb statements, but this one was a really, really smart one. And it was simply this: where else are we going to go? They had to look honestly at their lives, they had to look honestly at their past, and they had to say, do I really want to go back there? Do I really want to go back to that life that I had before? After what I've experienced, after what I now know, how in the world can I go back? I don't have a good answer. I don't have a good explanation. I don't understand this whole eat my flesh and drink my blood thing. I don't get it. But how can I go back to the life that I had before? My dad and I had some pretty amazing conversations. And my dad was a man of God. And he taught me a lot of what it meant to be a man of God and to be a Christ follower. And I remember going to the nursing home to see my Uncle George, my dad's oldest brother. Now when I grew up, my Uncle George was like my grandfather. I never knew my grandfather. He died a long time before I was born. But this man was like my grandfather. And he had been deaf since he was 20 years old. He was born in 1894. And he was just a very interesting man. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it. He was strong and he was powerful, even though he was deaf. But when he was 97 years old in the nursing home, and he lost his eyesight, and there was no way to communicate with him anymore because he was deaf and blind. And if you touched him just to show a little love and affection, he would recoil because it scared him. And it was horrible and pathetic. And I remember at that age, 16 years old or 17, I remember at that age just being so frustrated at that reality. And I walked out with my dad after we had visited some time with my Uncle George. And I go, God, Dad, it really makes me wonder sometimes if God is even there. I mean, why would that happen? How can you believe in God when you see stuff like that? And you know what my dad told me? He goes, what other choice do I have? Because if God isn't real, then what's the point? That's not apologetics. That's not, that didn't answer my, yeah, it did. Yeah, it did answer my question. Because if God isn't real, then what's the point of living anyway? I believe in God because I refuse to not believe in him. That's what my father was saying. And it was powerful. And that's what's going on in Simon Peter's life. We can't go back. We've already experienced what life is like with you. How do I go back? How do I go? I can't go back. I have to go forward even if I don't get my questions answered. Even if it doesn't make sense to me. I can't go back. Sometimes we can't focus on the questions. Sometimes we just have to consider the options. And the option here is really no option at all. I choose you, even if I don't have the answers. Even if it doesn't make sense to me right now, I choose you. Listen, at some point, at each and every one of our lives, eternity is going to become a very important thing to us. It may not be important right now. You may think you're immortal right now. But one of these days, whether it's you or someone you love, it's going to become very important to you. And in 1980, when I was crying on my bolster bed in Bible college, I got an instant answer. But let me tell you something. Way more often than not, when I'm disillusioned and I'm discouraged and I'm depressed and I have my head in my hands and I'm crying, I don't get one of those answers. You might think that I said that because, hey, well, maybe if I just pray real hard, something's going to come in under the door. No. Lots of times it doesn't. Most of the time it doesn't come in under the door. You just got to decide whether or not you're going to trust him or not. You got to look at your options even if you don't have the answers. But I'll say this. As I look back, even though I didn't have the answers, I always had him. And I know he does have the answers, even if he doesn't share them with me. And maybe that's the crux of this shocking statement. Jesus did not supply them with the explanation of his words. And it forced every one of them to realize the gravity of that relationship. And so to choose him was to choose him without the answers. To choose him was to realize he was the only option. And truly now, those 12, they're all in. And I would imagine that Jesus will take you to that same point and take me to that same point over and over again in a crisis of belief where you got to decide, do I trust you? We're moving to a time of decision.